Good evening, everyone.
Hello.
Welcome to the Holland Land Office Museum for our guest speaker series for 2026. This is a program we started, well, almost a decade ago, and it has exploded. So we've got stuff going on all the time here. We bring in speakers from all over the country, actually. But luckily, we don't have to look too far for most of our speakers because there's a lot of great presenters right in our own backyard. And tonight is no exception. Holly Watson, who is the Livingston County Historian, is back again to tell us the tale of the Sullivan Campaign. So we're very excited for that since it is the 250th this year, so it only feels applicable. We want to give thanks to Tompkins Community Bank and the Rotary Club of Batavia for helping to sponsor this, as well as GoArt. We received a grant through their Regrant Program. So I'll just read a little thing before we begin. I'd like to acknowledge GoArt's support of this project. GoArt recognizes that this gathering takes place on the ancestral lands of the Seneca Nation, part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and acknowledges their enduring presence in this region. So I want to thank you all for coming, and Holly, take it away.
All right, thank you, Ryan. Thanks, everybody. Good to see you all. You can hear okay, I hope. If it's too loud or scratchy, let me know. Okay, thanks, Vicki. Great, so Ryan did a nice introduction. I'm Holly Watson, the Livingston County Historian, so I work over at Mount Morris and research the Genesee Valley in general and kind of with a specificity of Livingston County. So today we're using some of the resources in my office and many out in the world. I have a research center, so anyone is welcome to make a question about historical buildings, people, places, events in especially Livingston County. So I do have some brochures if you want to take something away with you. Let me know if you have a question later on. So the Sullivan Campaign. Is anyone familiar with that name already and the event? Most of you probably know why you're here. Okay, well, we'll get into it a little bit. So the Sullivan Campaign is a very complex event. We're going to try to fit it into an hour.
I don't know how you're going to do it.
Yeah, well, we're going to have to skip over some stuff and just condense it. But hopefully it'll spark interest for more research if you're interested in learning more. But it's a complex event of the American Revolution that had a huge impact on the Genesee Valley and Western New York in general. And the Genesee Valley is at the heart of those events almost 250 years ago now. We're talking about 1779, so we're coming up on the anniversary of that. So today, the kind of roadmap, we're going to do some background about indigenous culture in Western New York, then a background about the American Revolution that led up to the Sullivan Campaign, included it. Then we'll specifically talk a little about the legend of the torture tree, since that's a very popular topic, and people have a lot of questions and thoughts about it. And then going to legacy and memory today. How do we remember this event and the American Revolution in general? All right, a map. I'm going to have a lot of maps in here. I hope you like maps as much as I do. So this is a map that shows some historical territory of the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois Confederacy. The Haudenosaunee mean the people who are building the longhouse. And we picture the state of New York, most of it anyway, as a traditional home, a longhouse, where a whole clan, a whole family would live. So working our way across the state, starting in the east, we have the Mohawk Nation territory, going all the way up into the Adirondacks. Then the Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca nations. And then the Tuscarora are in there as well. They've had some scattered settlements, even in our area, in the Genesee Valley, as well as kind of central New York and a traditional territory. So this map combines those traditional territories kind of with the vague dotted lines about where the territories were back in the 1770s or so, the kind of time period we're talking about. And it also has lots of those little purple shapes are current day reservations that are still occupied and governed by those nations that we're talking about. So what's interesting about that is the nations still have land. I know it's not as much compared to what this map once was, but the nations still have land in their original territory, which I recently learned is rather unusual in the United States. Many nations have moved far, far away from where they originally were, so in New York, that is kind of a unique and important thing to think about. Right. So this is the longhouse across the state. The Seneca Nation is where we are sitting now, and that they are the keeper of the western door. So thinking of protecting the western edge of the territory and protecting that western door of the house. The Seneca are known as the Onondaga and their native language, and they were the most the most populous and militarily powerful in the 1770s when we're talking about this happening, all this today, what we're talking about. So the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, is a very, very old democratic system. It was going on about 600 years old, as far as most people can tell, by the 1700s, and it's still going today. So a few things about the traditional lifestyle of the Haudenosaunee, and specifically Seneca. They're agricultural people, and traditionally there are some crops that are especially important to people. The three sisters, or the three sustainers. These are corn, beans, and squash, and they come in all forms. So it can kind of sound like, oh, that sounds like kind of a boring stew to have every day. But if you think about all of the kinds of crops you can grow that are under those umbrellas, and the sorts of things you can make with them, it's actually a really varied diet, and together they with of course some game, meat, fish, and deer and things like that, it makes a complete diet that's very healthy. So corn can be dried, it can be green, and even popcorn. So the Haudenosaunee are said to have introduced European Americans to popcorn, and I'm very grateful for this. I sometimes have popcorn as a meal, which is not a good diet, but it's very tasty. So then beans can also be dry or green, and squash can be a lot of different things. Cucumbers and melons and pumpkins and zucchini, all kinds of fresh vegetables, winter vegetables. So they also grow together really well, so they complement each other in a dish, but also in the ground. So if you plant a corn stalk, it grows really tall. Some kinds of beans can twirl around that corn stalk as they grow up. The corn just supports it, it doesn't care. But the beans provide some nitrogen back to the soil when they rot. And then the squash leaves are usually pretty large. They shade the ground to keep weeds down and retain moisture. So if you grow all these things together and plant each one at the right time, they can really make gardening and farming a lot easier. So it's this really cool traditional way of planting these crops together. This is a longhouse. It's a reconstruction that's over at Ganundagan. Yep, you said you had been to Ganundagan. Other people have been to Ganundagan ever? Yep, okay. Great. It's an excellent resource. I'll come back to it at the end too. But this is a traditional style home that the Seneca may have lived in. Kind of before contact with European Americans. By the time we're talking about, a lot of Seneca people lived in a log cabin or other kind of slightly more Western style home, and many of these cabins even had glass windows, which Europeans were surprised to see. But these trade routes extended across the country and even across the world. So the Seneca people would have had access by the 1700s to pottery from China, from Europe, metal pots. You didn't have to cook in a carved out wooden pot anymore, and all kinds of beads and jewelry and everything you could really want. Some of the trade routes, they're going to be hard to see in this picture, I think, but there are a lot of paths going around here. I'm going to zoom in on our area, which is a little easier to see, I hope. This is the western part of New York, not to scale at all in this map, but some of the places that were really important in about 1770 were Geneseo, which is sort of where the Genesee River and the Canasarega Creek join. Williamsburg was there later, just south of the village of Geneseo, and where the name Geneseo may have come from, Geneseo meaning Pleasant Valley. That was a principal village at one point. Canawagas is not properly on this map. It's really the border of Avon and Caledonia. They didn't quite know where to put it, but it's out here on the road toward Buffalo. And so all these little dotted lines are very early paths that were, many of them became our roads that we use today. They're in the same places. They just were expanded and used and expanded and used. And so they may seem familiar to us. So Big Tree and Little Beardstown and Canawagas, these are some of the important villages right around the Genesee River in the place we're talking about. So the settlements moved around a little bit. Sometimes they would move because of for fresh ground for growing, for fresh ground for hunting game. And so the villages that we're talking about, people would live there for a while, move to another location not too far away, and then move back some 20 or 30 years later, which is kind of something I had forgotten about. Any questions about Seneca life so far? Yes?
They would move because they exhausted the hunting, right?
Yeah, they usually need to kind of refresh a little bit. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but they weren't too far away and they came back.
Yeah, it's really only a few miles away usually,
They're
not too far. Yeah.
Connections.
Yep, lots of pathways, lots of connections, and people could travel. They traveled a lot, even though it was, didn't have a car. They still traveled pretty far. All right, so the Revolutionary War. We are in the 250th year now, so you've probably been hearing about it already a lot. I won't get into a Ken Burns level talk here about it, but it was a conflict lasting 8 years, and with a lot of lead up before it. It didn't just come out of nowhere and everyone decided, we're going to all band together this minute. There was a lot of conflict, discussion, politics, disputes going on before that led up to this conflict. But right here, the Sullivan Campaign was one of the largest offensives of the military offenses of the Revolutionary War, which is an impressive thing to think about. Considering all of those conflicts. They were mostly on the East Coast and not really around here, but the Sullivan Campaign is also the westernmost conflict of the Revolutionary War. And that happened right here in the Genesee Valley. So in the background, very briefly, was up in the 1600s, the 1700s, there was a lot of conflict at the frontier, which was right here too. There was conflict between the indigenous people who've been here for a long time and newcomers, the European American white settlers who were kind of pushing the boundaries of the frontier, moving westward generally. And sometimes those interactions were very peaceable. People worked together to grow things, to build things, but sometimes there was also conflict. And then you add Great Britain into the mix, which is, that was the governing body at that time, and the Revolutionary War sort of started to ramp up. So along the frontier, there were a lot of raids. So you might have heard that word before, but effectively it's just conflicts back and forth between British and Loyalist people, usually sometimes with Native American allies and the colonists, and then people in between. So there would be a violent attack on a Native village. There would be retaliation. Those Native people might retaliate against those that attacked them, and so this kind of kept going on and on, building up and getting more and more tense and violent as time went on. The tipping points were Cherry Valley and Wyoming Valley. Cherry Valley is near Albany. Wyoming is in Pennsylvania. They were tipping points because they were particularly violent and bloody and just bad all around. But what came of that was George Washington deciding that something had to be done, in his opinion, because the revolution was now underway, and Great Britain was strengthened by a lot of allyships with the Native American people. So, just a picture of an old apple tree, supposedly planted near Squawky Hill by the Seneca. The Seneca people tried to stay neutral during this ramp up. They didn't want to get involved in someone else's war, but it was hard because their territory was in the middle, was part of the conflict too. So the complex trade and diplomacy that they had for a long time with Great Britain meant that they sided with the British effectively, you could say it that way. It wasn't really that they necessarily thought that the British cause was better, more noble. It was just that they were the bigger power. I mean, if you had to decide who to side with, would you go with the rebel upstarts? It may not be that clear. So you may not feel that would get you what you wanted. You needed to protect your territory, your culture, your language, and your people. And the British promised sovereignty and promised that they could keep their land if they worked together with the British. So that was how that played out. And across the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Most did end up siding with the British. A couple sided with the colonists, the Oneida and Tuscarora generally. So George Washington saw the Seneca were helping the British out with a lot of food stores, supplies, and people on the ground who were able to fight. So George Washington ordered John Sullivan and James Clinton, two other generals, to take armies all the way into this area, which was absolute frontier as far as the Europeans and Americans thought. So his orders are pretty blunt, I guess. Part of them, Washington wrote, "The immediate objects are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements, and the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. It will be essential to ruin their crops now in the ground and prevent their planting more. Also, the necessity of pushing the Indians to the greatest practical distance, throwing them wholly on the British enemy." So what they were looking to do was to destroy villages and crops to weaken the power that the Seneca had here and other Haudenosaunee nations along their route, and make sure that the British had to take care of the people that winter. This was scheduled for the summer and fall, so it would be, you couldn't plant any more beans and corn and squash and have enough for your stores that winter. And so the British relied on the Seneca and other nations so much for those food stores for their people that taking on refugees that winter would be a hardship for them. So that was Washington's grand plan, and this is how it played out. So there were two main armies, one from eastern Pennsylvania through Wyoming, where the Wyoming Valley event had happened, and up from about Cherry Valley. So they joined up in Tioga, just at the Pennsylvania-New York border, came up through the Finger Lakes area, above Canandaigua, and into the Genesee Valley through Honeoye, Canisius, finally making it to Little Beardstown, which is in Cuylerville, in the town of Leicester, and then back the way they came once it was over. So again, this is 1779 in September. This is what they were doing. So they only had enough provisions to really make this trip for a few days. They couldn't make it all the way to Fort Niagara, which is all the way to the upper left. That was the British stronghold and would have been great if they could get there. There was sort of a hope that they would, but they just couldn't make it with the provisions that they had and the time. It was starting to turn into fall, get cold, so they couldn't do that. So that's kind of the big map, and then if we zoom into our area and the events of the day, the red line coming through here is the route that the army took, more or less. They came in from Honeoye, Hemlock, and camped in what is now the town of Canisius, I should say. And so then after they were camping there, they sent out a little reconnaissance party to go see where Genesee Castle, or the Little Beardstown principal town, where it really was. Their maps were not great because not too many people had surveyed out here yet, and so they didn't really have a great idea of how far it was going to be or how to get there. So the General Sullivan ordered one particular guy, Lieutenant Boyd, to take only about a handful of people with him to go do this reconnaissance mission. He ended up taking somewhere around 25 or 29, so it was kind of a lot of people, considering you have to be very, very quiet, very careful, not to be seen. So it already was a bigger party than it was supposed to be, but they headed out toward Little Beardstown, which is up there in the top left. I guess they made it about to Groveland, and then returned back, but on the way back there was an ambush. So there were Tory or Loyalist soldiers and some Seneca fighters as well. And so most of the scouting parties did not return, including Boyd and Parker, the sergeant and a private, who were taken all the way to Little Beardstown, where terrible things happened. So then, as they went back to a few of them escaped and went back to the camp, and the next day the army marched the rest of the way to Little Beardstown. And Oops, I didn't mean to do that yet. So they went to Little Beardstown the next day. The villages had been abandoned this whole time, and along their route, both armies were burning crops and burning houses all along, and did the same at Little Beardstown when they got there. But there were no people left except for one white woman apparently who was left behind. It was not Mary Jemison, although Mary Jemison did live at the site at that point, and then went off to Letchworth essentially, where she ended up living later. So she's a really famous character. We don't have a lot of time to talk about her, but she can have her whole presentation. I think she has, and she will again. After completing the mission, essentially mission was accomplished as far as the Americans were concerned. They went back the same way they came. And as far as the people at Little Beardstown and other places along the way, most of them, kind of as suspected, went to Fort Niagara because that was where the British were, where they were hoping to be cared for. Unfortunately, it was a really terrible winter. This is like a sunny day at Fort Niagara, but it looks bitterly cold right there on the lake. It's been very windy lately. It makes me think about how cold that must have been. So needless to say, that was not a good winter. A lot of people were suffering from cold and hunger and disease at Fort Niagara. Let's see, any questions about that so far? Yes?
What's the closest village to the Parker Boyd monument?
Right, Cuylerville would be the closest kind of settlement. The village of Geneseo and Cuylerville are both pretty close, but
The torture tree is not there anymore.
we'll talk about the torture tree.
What
It is,
it
yeah.
was there.
Well, it is. We have a lot to say about the torture tree.
Yeah.
But yes, near Cuylerville at the Boyd and Parker Memorial Park. Can you picture that, or you kind of know where it is?
The general.
39,
Generally.
63 area.
Yeah. We can talk more about that too. You have a question also?
Okay, on the map, it's the Hermitage.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know where that is? I've been trying to find sort of where that is.
I think the one you're talking about, so down here, the point where the scouting party did make it, it says the Hermitage, there's a tiny little square. That was a home of Charles Carroll, I believe. It is no longer there, but the Carrolls and the Fitzhughs were really early and very large landowning families who came to Groveland, and their home was called the Hermitage.
There isn't
So-
a home back there anymore.
There is, like, I keep seeing a house back there, but it's not the Hermitage anymore.
We
Yeah.
have markers now.
Yeah, there might be a marker and it's around Williamsburg area too.
You
Not
know,
too far.
I've heard that's kind of like as far as Boyd Parker got.
That's correct,
It was
yeah.
sort of there where they camped out.
Yeah, that's correct. They were like, they thought it was, I think, they thought it was Little Beardstown where they were trying to get to, but it had been abandoned. Their maps and information were old. Little Beardstown had effectively moved across the river to Cuylerville a few years before that. So they made it there, and then there was there was some conflict, so they didn't make it further than that. But, good. Any other questions at this juncture?
You're doing good.
Thank you. All right, so bitterly terrible Fort Niagara. It was obviously really impactful to the people who lived there. It was a really hard winter. After the winter, though, the Seneca people did return to villages. They rebuilt, they came back. It was so impactful, though, that their numbers were never quite the same. It was never quite as strong as it had been before this event. So it is, needless to say, not remembered fondly. Some scholars and indigenous people feel that it was a genocidal act. So it was not a good moment for everyone, but we can learn, and people are resilient. So we will focus on the torture tree. So this is on why can't I remember the name of it? Cuylerville Road. So yeah, you were asking where it was exactly. I don't have a good map for you in this presentation at this moment, but. Yeah, if you go down the hill from Geneseo and toward the village of Leicester, you pass through Cuylerville. Do you know where the National Hotel is by any chance?
I do.
Okay. It's not open anyway, you can't go today, but yeah, it's a beautiful old canal tavern right where the Genesee Valley Canal used to go. It's another landmark. So, so the torture tree, part of the story of Boyd and Parker. Is anybody familiar with this already? You probably heard it in school even. That's right. So Boyd and Parker were taken from the scouting party by the Seneca warriors and the and loyalists. Brant and Boyd were, Brant and Butler were involved in this as well. So a British leader and a Native American one who was sided with the British at that time. So Boyd and Parker were taken to this now park and memorial site, and there are a lot of wonderful, very useful primary sources written about this event. Everybody on both sides was very, we didn't have the Geneva Convention. There was torture. There were brutal acts on both sides. And the diaries describe what happened that day, which I'll let you go find that on your own. But the diaries describe what these soldiers found when the rest of the army got to Little Beardstown. Needless to say, also Boyd and Parker were no longer with us. So they buried them with honors at this site and then left again. So in the 1820s or so is when I've pinpointed the story was exaggerated a little bit more. So there were a lot of difficult things to read about that happened. One of the stories that evolved later was that Boyd and Parker were disemboweled as well on the site. And it had to do with a tree, walking around a tree, something like that. And as it turns out, this kind of punishment, medieval torture, was written about in England. So it was like being drawn and quartered. I never knew what that meant really. I looked it up and wish I hadn't. But it's kind of a medieval torture that maybe did happen or was used to describe the severity of what your enemy would do to you. And so it was perhaps maybe unintentional, maybe it was a game of telephone over time, or maybe people intentionally exaggerated it to make it sound like the Seneca were worse than they were. Journal entries describe the soldiers on the American side doing some pretty terrible scalpings and skinnings and awful things like that too. So it was not out of the ordinary perhaps, but difficult for the people to see who came upon the site. So by the 1920s, it was coming up on an anniversary of this event, and local historians and people were talking about commemorating it. And that's when I find the name torture tree first mentioned. About 100 years earlier, I think this was the Guts story came to be popularized through a book by Mary Jemison, or by a ghostwritten for her by James Seaver. So it's a really interesting book about Mary Jemison's life, and it gives a glimpse into life with Seneca in the 1700s and early 1800s. And in that story, Mary Jemison was not there to lay eyes on the scene that I know of. She, like the whole village, fled to keep herself safe before the army got there. But in her book, it describes this really gory event. And so I think that's when it started into the popular culture of the Guts part, as I like to fondly call it. And if you look at the diaries, though, of the people who were there, they mention all these awful things, but not that particular detail. So it's kind of a myth that is floating around in the water. It has some truth to it in that some awful things happened, but not that bad. And the story kind of became exaggerated over the years. So the torture tree itself is what is remembered as the torture tree is still at the site, and it's this huge bur oak tree. If you go, it looks large in a picture, and this is an old picture. If you go up to it, it's really a remarkable being. It's just enormous. It's the girth around it, and its spread is really enormous too. It survived the salt mine collapse, the collapse in the 1990s of the Retzoff salt mine. It bumped down a bit, but it's still growing, and it's still okay. And so it's remembered it's remembered, it kind of it plants roots for this story. It's something you can see to remember these events, so it's kind of a landmark in that way. There are a lot of interpretive signs around to tell you what happened there. Most of those signs were put up in the 1920s or so, and so they could be updated. They kind of tell, let's say, one side of the story a little more than the other sides. But there are a lot of perspectives here, so it does, that makes a difference. Let's see, I'm losing my spot here. So this tree in the 1990s was determined to be old enough to be there in the 1770s, 1779, but it probably was pretty small. It was probably only a sapling at that point. So that's another reason why it probably didn't play the role that everyone thinks it did. It didn't look exactly like this 250 years ago. But this tree has kind of grown into that story and become a reminder of that story for people. And memory about the players in general has kind of evolved over time. So if you read those old plaques and historical markers, they talk about heroism and grueling military effort and all this on the side of the American Army. And so it was very much, the stories have been very much told from that perspective and not necessarily telling much about how the Seneca have felt about it ever since. So I think people have a little bit more of an appetite to talk about both sides, all perspectives. The British one too. I found the recent Ken Burns documentary interesting for that reason. It did a good job, I thought, of introducing all these different perspectives that I didn't know much about before. So the memory about Native Americans in general has shifted too. So in the 1840s and 1850s, as the Revolutionary War soldiers themselves were getting older and passing away, the sentiments, the language used to talk about the Native Americans was still pretty heated, I would say. It was still a lot of savages and words like that we find derogatory today. And it's because it was still pretty fresh in everybody's minds. The Mary Jemison book, written in the 1820s, even though she lived with them, the way it was written, and it wasn't necessarily her words, but it isn't always speaking super kindly of the Native Americans and using words that make them sound a little bit more scary, more violent than perhaps necessary. Or at least, the wording of it it hasn't held up, shall we say. And so as time went on through the 1800s, what we've noticed is, especially by the late 1800s, when the West was being won, and essentially, if you want to put it bluntly, the Native Americans just weren't as powerful, as much of a threat to people who were living on a frontier of any kind as the West kept moving. The tone sort of shifted from being pretty heated to being more nostalgic. So it became, even today it's changed even more, but at the time the nostalgia kind of came out as, they were just the noble savage, I guess, is a trope that you might have heard of before. It's someone who's not perhaps very sophisticated, but is very, very noble in their demeanor and their actions. And so that's kind of shifted into, like, if you think about kind of stereotypes of Native Americans today, do you think of like Pocahontas kind of, or tiptoeing through the forest, if that feels familiar at all, you can kind of see where the shift has been happening. And so it's shifted from quite drastically, and that's a stereotype in itself, to think about a Pocahontas kind of figure who might be very connected to nature and living lightly on the land and singing to animals and being, very in tune with things like that. And so that's a stereotype too, although it's more of a positive one, I suppose. It's not about violence, but it's also not totally accurate. It's a little romanticized. So that's kind of how memory has shifted around just the general topics and people. So about 100 years ago, when some of these signs were put up around the torture tree, it was still pretty one-sided, like, oh, it's too bad that we had to do that. It's too bad that the Senecas and other Haudenosaunee people sided with the wrong side, perhaps. And some scholars have said that it is essentially trying to lift the blame a little bit from those who live around here, like, oh, it wasn't us and our ancestors who might have been involved, it wasn't really their fault, because we live here. And so that story has been shifting, and I think people are interested in hearing a little bit more about the other perspectives. So at this site, some of the signs I was talking about, there are several boulders and plaques to go visit, because these physical sites are associated with both Seneca heritage and, of course, the events of the Sullivan Campaign too, and these sites are lasting reminders of those events, and across all of Western New York, actually. So again, this is Cuylerville with the torture tree, so-called. And so that's sort of a legendary reminder in itself, and the boulder and interpretive sign next to it. And Boyd and Parker, as I mentioned, were buried here in the 1840s, 1841, right after the Genesee Valley Canal was completed to Mount Morris, between Rochester and Mount Morris. A big ceremony was held to disinter them and the other scouts that were found in Groveland and take them up to Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, because they were building a new Patriots Hill, a place specifically to bury Revolutionary War veterans or soldiers. And so this, as the story goes, they had much fanfare taking the remains up to Rochester, and they had a large ceremony, but then a huge rainstorm blew in, and everybody scattered for shelter. And for some time, at least the story goes, the bones were never reburied at Patriots Hill. So there were several. It took a while. Eventually, by the early 1900s, supposedly whatever was left there was put into a new Patriots Hill by I think a DAR chapter. So they hopefully finally got buried, but were kind of in limbo there for a little while. So for some reason, Mount Hope kind of tried to redeem itself eventually. The other site, that one is owned by the town of Leicester in Cuylerville. The other site is in Groveland. If anyone has been up here to the Groveland Ambuscade, a few of you have. So on this lovely little hill overlooking farmland, almost overlooking Genesee Lake, you can kind of see it. This monument was put up in 1901 by the Historical Society, Livingston County Historical Society. So this spot is memorialized as where that ambush took place. So it was where the scouting party was trying to go back and forth to scout, and the loyalists and Seneca people who knew the land a lot better, I'll add, where they had that conflict. So the language on this monument was of its time as well, and if you walk all the way around it, it does list the names that they knew of the people who died in that conflict on that site. But they missed a couple because in 1901 they didn't have every record. They had some more records appeared, including there was an Oneida guide with the scouting party. He was said to be Hanieri. It's actually his brother Hanyost. So the correct name was added on a little plaque on the back of it. So it's kind of one of those things where information does come up later. You think you know everything, something else arrives and to change your plan about that. And so you just have to be sort of like a detective and update your story once in a while, and that's okay. It's just how history works. It's how history research works. So up on this little hill, there's also a pavilion nearby, and it's owned by the town of Groveland as well. So you can go visit that if you wish to. So going back to today, all these monuments, all these visual reminders of what happened here so long ago, when the settlements are gone and all that's left is a tree that was probably very small at the time, which is now big and impressive, and these boulders. It's pretty easy to see and remember the campaign, the military event that was only a couple days long, but was such a watershed event, especially for European Americans, because it led to the western frontier being pushed further and further west, white settlement, buying up our little parcels, through agents such as the Holland Land Company, whose office we're sitting in. So it's important to remember that these sites also mark the homes of the Seneca people who lived in the villages that were so impacted during that time. And it's important to remember the resilience of those people too. So some of these pictures are talking about how people have been resilient, are continuing, the traditions continue and continue updating just as all culture does. It's never totally stagnant. But up in the left corner we have the Iroquois White Corn Project. That's grown down near the Cattaraugus territory, I believe, and Ganundigan also has a part in processing the corn. So you can buy this commercially. It's a heritage version of, or heritage breed of corn grown by the Seneca people here. Did you say it's delicious? It is, I think so too. You can get the corn flour, and you can get it either plain or toasted, which I recommend because it makes really nice shortbread. And you can even take part in, I think they have a husking bee at Ganundigan State Historic Site in Victor. We're seeing inside the replica longhouse at Ganundigan as well on the right side. So during the summer season, that's open, so visitors can go see what traditional life would have been like living in a longhouse with these tiered beds and storage areas and some of the tools and everyday objects that people would have used traditionally back in like the 1600s when this site was particularly active. Now it's a state historic site and staffed by a lot of people who are native themselves, and so many of them are learning languages again, Mohawk and Seneca included, and are happy to talk about their experiences. And this is something I learned about recently. You recognize this little guy?
Dashboard.
Oh, yeah, it doesn't bore into trees, this one. That's a good guess, though. These ones buzz really, really loudly in the summer. Cicadas? Yeah, you got it. So this kind we don't have around here exactly, but they are in central New York. It's called the periodical cicada. It has the bright red eyeballs, which is pretty freaky. Those are the ones that come out kind of every 17 years in a huge batch. And so the story goes, in the Onondaga culture, tradition, during the Sullivan Campaign, the Onondaga were also impacted by that route of the army burning villages and crops. So that winter was very hard for them as well. And at that late summertime, I guess it somehow corresponded that there was a burst of cicadas, and so people relied on cicadas to eat as a bit of protein to stay alive. Not something that I would run to eat, but if you have to, that's apparently what happened. So to this day, kind of as a symbol, some people who are Onondaga still eat at least one cicada during that time when they all come out. And I'm not trying to gross you out, it is kind of gross. I don't know if I would run to eat one, as I said, but apparently they're good with garlic and butter if you're sauteing them up. Again, it's a symbol. It's not like, oh, these people eat cicadas. It's a symbol of remembering what they've been through and that they're still here. So that was something I learned about. Have you had one?
If you do it right.
Yeah? Have you had a grasshopper or a cricket? That's also something people eat. No, you're not going to do it? Okay. Nope, no pressure. I didn't bring any with me or anything. It's food. It's a lot of protein. And again, it's not like necessarily a delicacy, but it's a reminder of that resiliency. So a couple places you can visit. We talked about Ganundigan in Victor. There's also the Seneca Iroquois National Museum in Salamanca, which is one of the capitals of the Seneca Nation today. And this one's at Fort Niagara. Do you know someone in the picture?
Yeah, I know two of this.
Oh, very cool.
But these elders are gone now.
Are they? Yeah. This picture might be from a few years ago. It's from the old Fort Niagara Facebook page. That is Fort Niagara in the background, so they're doing a dancing demonstration and competition at Fort Niagara. The reason I put this one in is just to show joy and dancing and some of the traditional clothes for the dancing. But I just learned that Fort Niagara is going to be building a kind of log cabin style education center that is going to be teaching about Native Americans in this area. And so that should be opening this spring. I don't have more details for you, but keep an eye out for it. So I thought that was kind of interesting and ties in because that Fort Niagara site was the place of, you know, a lot of difficulty, but also some Native people see it as a place where they were survived and were protected at a time that was really hard for them. So I thought that was pretty cool to be looking up for. So I urge you all to try some white corn, go to one of these sites, learn a little bit more. I'm not Native myself, so you know, I can't speak for anyone, but there's so many ways to learn about the culture today, to keep up with it and learn these other perspectives that haven't been talked about quite as often.
It's
So-
Octagon, they have a festival,
Yeah.
2-day weekends,
Mhm.
and it's awesome.
What is it? What kind of festival is it?
It's in the summer, it's actually summer and fall, just with the corn is starting to be done.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good food too.
Very good. Yeah.
I
Awesome.
mean, it's some good.
I think I remember there's a meal part of it. You can have a meal there. Yep. Yeah, they have events all year and certainly in the summer especially. All right, so as we wrap up here, we've seen a little bit more about how the Genesee Valley has played a major role in these kind of watershed events about 250 years ago, and that lasting impact on indigenous people and the land of Western New York, how we all have come to be right here today. And also how resilient people are and how life can go on and continue. And for us to remember also, it's important. So I'm happy to answer any questions. I don't know how much time I have.
You got a great time.
We good? Okay. Oh, perfect. We're not quite at an hour. So yeah, does anyone have any questions at this moment about anything we talked about? Anything else? Yes.
Just one question, and excellent presentation.
Thanks, Al.
Thanks.
Very good.
You know, these folks that feel it was a genocide, the Sullivan Campaign is part of all that. They seem to be very strident, and their views seem to have a lot of power in today's world, sort of ethical power. Do you know what they want? If they could have, you know, what do they want? Do they think Western New York should still live like the Seneca lived?
I can't speak for the people who feel that way. I'm kind of just parsing what I hear, what other people have said. So yeah, I couldn't quite say if anyone has one single hope. I think people feel overlooked perhaps with all of these boulders that say the heroes who were murdered here and by the savages. I think that recognition is probably, it's a first start. Whether you call it by that name or not, that isn't for me to decide either. But you know, acknowledging what has happened and how we can work together better in the future. So yeah, I would encourage you to ask someone who might feel that way personally and feel like sharing about it.
And I can say real quick,
Yeah.
I asked Dr. Over from Genesee State, who I think is one of the fits into that camp, and he was like, I don't know. Like, I don't know which was interesting. So I think that's a very tough question, and I think you answered it very
That was a test, wasn't it?
well. Not a test,
I'm
but
kidding.
like if Ober doesn't know.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Right, he's a scholar of this.
I wanted to mention that the museum in Geneseo, the County History Museum, is got a date scheduled with Oberg in September. The dates of the, I think September 13th or something. The last time he spoke for us at the college, we had 250 people.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have a county historical museum.
Yes, there are two different entities, and they're very confusing because they have practically the same name. So I am one of them, the Livingston County Historian's office. I have all the pictures and maps and documents and things. And then in Geneseo, I'm Mount Morris. In Geneseo, the one that you just mentioned is the Livingston County Historical Society and Museum. So much like the Holland Land Company Museum, Land Office Museum, I get your name wrong every time. They have displays there and docents who can show you around. So more artifacts and things to see. One that might connect is they have a section that's very large of another enormous tree called the Big Tree. It has become connected to the Treaty of Big Tree, so one of the major landmark treaties of Western New York. They have a section of that original tree that fell down in the 1850s, and It's also connected in memory to the tree. The tree didn't necessarily happen right under it. It was not far away. Long story, but they have a beautiful display of that, and the actual tree, you can get up and look inside, so it's kind of a neat thing. Did I say that okay?
The picture's that later. I'm gonna go.
We should mention our museum is up for remodeling, so you should probably call ahead because I think we're going to, in a month or two,
Gotcha, you might be closed for a
close
minute.
for a long time, maybe.
Okay, thanks for that reminder. That's exciting. Yes?
Yeah, you talk about Ken Burns, but those two books that Rick Atkinson just wrote, one's The British Are Coming, that certainly gives a lot of different perspective, you know, the British perspective and
Excellent.
Native people perspective.
Yeah,
Anybody hasn't read those, they're pretty thorough books, they were kind of eye-openers.
great, I appreciate that. Thank you
The
for
names
mentioning.
of-
There's a lot out there.
The British Are Coming, one is the name of the other book.
What was the
You
name of
mentioned two books.
The first one is The British Are Coming, I can't remember right now the name of the other one.
Okay, but Atkinson?
Rick Atkinson,
Okay,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering though, what happened? Did it have a significant impact on the American colonist army for the rest of the war, or was this like a temporary thing?
Right.
You know,
Yeah, good question. Thank you for asking for clarification on it. Yeah, it was considered a success because the native fighters, the armies that they had, the military force, was in fact weakened. The British therefore were as well because they had to care for a lot of refugees essentially that winter. And it didn't immediately end the war. It wasn't that successful. There was still fighting on many other fronts, obviously for a few more years. But it did significantly help the American Army, and certainly as far as like land claims in New York and agreements with the British later, it had an impact for the frontier expansion, certainly. Yeah. There's a lot more to say about that, but we are out of time.
I think
That's all right.
Rob
Yeah.
Thompson, who's going to be here signing books,
Uh-huh.
wrote a good book on it too, and I've got a copy of that.
Okay, very good.
I'll be here for that.
All right.
No,
Any last questions? I will be here to chat afterward if you want to come up and talk while I clean up. Okay. Thank you so much for coming.